Okay, that was the first theory for conviction of murder 2, depraved heart. Now let's tackle, as part of our lecture, the felony murder rule for the second theory for conviction. We need to prove 5 elements for the felony murder rule to be invoked. First, that the felony is inherently dangerous, that defendant intended to commit the felony, that the victims died during the commission of this felony, that while inherently dangerous, the underlying felony is not assaultive in nature, and finally, in the majority of jurisdictions, that defendant directly committed these deaths. Setting the stage, let's remember 2 points. First, we're speaking about murder 2 or felony murder 2. It can't be murder 1 through the felony murder rule because manufacturing meth isn't specifically listed as one of the felonies to trigger the rule inside the murder 1 statute. We'd have to see it specifically listed there for murder 1 to apply. The court points this out when it explains the first-degree felony murder rule applies to felonies that are statutorily specified. And to date, states have not put manufacturing meth in their murder 1 statutes. So if prosecution's going to use the theory of felony murder rule, it's got to be a theory for murder 2, or what we call felony murder 2. Second, we want to remember that the only difference between our analysis for felony murder 1 and for felony murder 2 is the felony used to trigger the rule. Otherwise, all the rest of the elements are identical and have to be proven. For the moment, let's leave aside whether this felony of manufacturing meth is inherently dangerous, and I want to quickly analyze the remaining elements. As a reminder, prosecution's got to prove all of them for the rule to be invoked. So let's jump to element number 2. Did defendant intend to violate the law and manufacture meth? The answer is yes. One can see her specific intent to commit this crime. Okay. Next element, element number 3. Did her children die during the commission of manufacturing meth? Yes, tragically, they actually died while she was cooking meth. The trailer exploded while she was in the middle of doing that. And as long as manufacturing meth is not an assaultive crime by its nature, that next element is met. That's true. The crime of manufacturing meth does not have assault or injury as its primary purpose. Finally, we would say defendant was the direct cause of her children's deaths. So now let's circle back to the first element. Is this felony of manufacturing meth an inherently dangerous felony? That's what the court had to determine. The court stated that an inherently dangerous felony is one that by its very nature can't be committed without creating a substantial risk that someone will be killed. Or, as the court says at another point, is there a high probability of death associated with this violation? The court then makes a very important statement. It says that to determine this, we must consider a felony in the abstract. That means we have to consider it generally, not with the specific facts of this case, only by looking at the words of the statute. That can feel a little tricky. After all, we just went through the specific facts to prove depraved heart murder. How they're in a trailer, 3 little kids, James' belief. But for this element of felony murder, specific facts cannot be considered when we examine whether it's inherently dangerous. We need to look at the felony's elements in general, or the way a felony is conducted in general to see if it's dangerous. We cannot look at the fact that this was a trailer and that 3 little children were at her feet while she was cooking the meth. As the court says, it has to be considered in the abstract. Otherwise, every felony would be dangerous in a particular case because someone had died. My victim on the 2nd floor, you remember, who watches her car being stolen, clutches her heart and die. If we looked at larceny, not in the abstract, but in that particular case, we could make an argument for felony murder, but we have to look at it in the abstract. So, how do we consider whether a felony is dangerous in the abstract? We need to consider all the possible scenarios, no matter whether the felony of cooking meth is committed by a scientist, the mom in a trailer, or a high school student in the science lab at school. Is that crime inherently dangerous so that it creates a substantial risk that someone will be killed? And here's the second reason why it was so valuable to see the recipe for cooking meth. Not only does it show how dangerous the behavior is for depraved heart murder, it shows us in the abstract that cooking meth is inherently dangerous no matter who cooks it. everyone's going to be dealing with the same highly flammable materials and the same sources of heat. Indeed, the court rebuffs as nonsense that highly skilled people could commit this crime in a way that's not dangerous in general. The court says that the question is not whether it's possible to commit it safely, but whether a violation of the statute involves a high probability of death. And the court concludes in James, cooking meth is an inherently dangerous felony when viewed in the abstract. Our takeaway for whether a felony is inherently dangerous is the following. If the crime is specifically enumerated in the Murder I statute, the legislature has found it to be inherently dangerous. There is no need for further analysis. No need to say, well, is burglary really inherently dangerous in the abstract? But if the felony is not listed in the Murder I statute, and it is a felony, then we have to roll up our sleeves and we have to analyze whether the felony is inherently dangerous for purposes of triggering felony murder 2. And to determine that, we need to ask whether generally or in the abstract there's a high probability of death associated with this violation. We've examined several elements of felony murder. Now I want to examine more in depth element number 4, that the felony, while inherently dangerous, can't be assaultive in nature for felony murder to apply. This element is only going to come into question for us for felonies that are not listed in the Murder I statute. Those felonies which are attempting to trigger felony murder 2. So sort of think about element number 4 as only related to those felonies that aren't specifically named in the Murder I statute, because the legislature has already determined that there's a separate purpose for those felonies: burglary, robbery, rape, mayhem, arson. They have separate purposes, even if assault might be combined in a couple of those crimes. So, looking at element number 4, an inherently dangerous felony that's not assaultive in nature. The fundamental policy behind this element is that there's no deterrent value in charging felony murder where the underlying felony is assaultive in nature. In that case, the death that occurs from the assaultive felony is too wrapped up in the commission of the crime to ask the felon, oh, please commit your crime safely. Of course, he can't commit his crime safely because the whole purpose of the felony is to kill or seriously injure. So the state's going to need to prove that the felony is inherently dangerous but not assaultive in nature. That means generally. An assaultive felony always risks immediate violent injury each time it's committed. Such felonies include assault with a deadly weapon or firing at an occupied vehicle. You could see that built into those felonies is the immediate risk of violent injury every time the felony is committed. That's different from other inherently dangerous felonies that pose a substantial risk of death, but it's not this immediate violent injury that's going to happen every time the crime's committed. This just means a significant risk, not that death is always likely. So for example, in the case that we covered, when manufacturing meth, there's always a risk of explosion that could cause death. The court said that's true in James. But even if it happens relatively rarely, that's sufficient for the crime to be deemed inherently dangerous in the abstract. Assaultive by nature felonies are ones that are inherently dangerous, plus they always risk immediate and violent injury every time they're violated. This result, or this element, comports with the goal of the felony murder rule, which really is to deter accidental killings during the felonies. There are ways to manufacture meth more safely, so it makes sense to say to the defendant, you're going to be held strictly liable. We want to deter you from committing the crime, and we want you to spend special effort to make the crime as safe as possible. But firing a weapon at an occupied vehicle always risks immediate violent injury, even if the violent injury doesn't happen. And so the felony murder rule deterrent rationale doesn't apply to assaultive crimes like that one. Element number 4, it can't be assaultive in nature, is sometimes called the merger doctrine. We can't use felony murder as the theory where the underlying felony results in or is an integral part of the homicide. For that reason, assault as the underlying felony can never serve as the triggering felony for felony murder. There's no deterrent value. Could I really walk up to Barnett as he's holding that hoe and say to him, oh, do your felony safely? he would have turned around and hit me as well. He wanted to hit that guy. The felony and death are too wrapped up together. That's why the merger doctrine prevents the application of the felony murder rule. And this makes sense. After all, look where the opposite rule might lead us. It would mean that any punch in a bar that leads to a death could turn involuntary manslaughter into murder too automatically, simply because we invoke the felony murder rule. And this is really important to the courts. Courts have a fear of extending felony murder beyond a core set of circumstances, and that's echoed in nearly every opinion on felony murder. Courts around the country are very critical of the fact that the felony murder rule is an artificial construct, because it doesn't really impose malice from traditional ways. Instead, it takes a man-endangering state of mind that defendant has in committing a different felony and applies it somewhat arbitrarily to the death that follows. To emphasize this belief, the court in Barnett quoted the California Supreme Court in its landmark case of People versus Ireland. There, the California Supreme Court stated that applying the felony murder rule to assaults that result in deaths would extend the rule beyond any rational function it was designed to serve. And quite critically, the California court noted every time we use the felony murder rule, it precludes a jury from considering malice in traditionally associated ways.